once again to the Upper Room. Great to be with you, and we're going to do something special for the next 2 or 3 weeks anyway. We're on a little side trip, kind of a journey through the western United States to get back in touch with some of you all in our house churches and just have some face-to-face time with you, and we're totally enjoying that. And in the meantime, we're doing a lot of traveling, but we wanted to keep doing lessons. So we're going to do a turnout in the road, if you will, just kind of jump out of the Sermon on the Mount series for just a little bit and talk about the times in which we live. So we're going to call this little mini-series, whether it be 2 or 3 lessons, the times in which we live, and that is recognizing what's going on in our world, but more importantly, how would Jesus have us live in these times. So let me start with something that's kind of fun. I love looking at bumper stickers, and when you're on the road, as much as we are right now, you see a lot of bumper stickers. So let me go through a few that I've seen in the past. I'll give you my favorite one to begin with, and then we'll kind of go from there. My favorite bumper sticker of all time is Humpty Dumpty was pushed. I love that. Talk about conspiracy theories. But let's give you a few others, and then the last one we get to will kind of lead us into what we want to talk about. Another one I saw one time was, I don't really care about your stick figure family. You see those stick figures on the back of vans or whatever the case may be. There's the famous one that says, my student is an honor student, right? My child is an honor student. And a bumper sticker I saw in response to that was, my student can beat up your honor student. I know that's politically incorrect, but I just found it kind of funny. Another classic is, the fact that nobody understands you does not mean you're an artist. And of course, there's he who dies with the most toys wins. We'll kind of go back to that a little bit in this lesson. And then ultimately, life is hard and then you die. That kind of summarizes how a lot of people feel, at least at some point in their life. And life has gotten really challenging, hasn't it? In these times in which we live, we're seeing things, hearing things, experiencing things that our ancestors, our generational, connections going back a long time have never experienced. So I want to talk a little bit about that, not go deep into it, because honestly, if you can't see what's going on, if you're not hearing it and seeing it every day in our culture, then you're either just not paying attention, which God bless you for not paying attention. I think there's nothing wrong with not paying attention to what's going on. They desperately need you and me to pay attention to all the shenanigans going on in our culture. However, if you are paying attention, and most of the people we're connected with do pay attention, it's interesting that most people are absolutely frightened, or they're so astonished or shocked. You might remember that 1.5 years ago, I did a lesson. I think we called it, You're Not in Kansas, or We're Not in Kansas Anymore. And the concept was, this is not the country, this is not the culture that most of us grew up in. Now, our kids will know nothing different, but things have changed and are changing daily. And in that lesson, I talked about the fact that Marxism had taken hold, and it's been a long journey for those who want to embed Marxism into our culture, but it has now taken hold in our culture, and they have made great strides, and that is truly the culture now in which we live. And they've done it through, of course, through the government and education, the media, and now big corporations are all on board. There's words that are used like woke, but what that means is you don't dare question the narrative of the Marxist agenda that is being laid out. Okay, that's about as much as I want to say about it. Again, if you don't notice it, okay, take my word for it. Our culture is changing. Now, what you need to remember about that lesson, without going back to it, is this, that traditionally the Marxist movement has at its foundation a hatred for God and a hatred for anybody that is associated with God. So the Marxist movement is really demonic, and we can go into detail, but go and study Marx and his hatred for the things of God. And so all that means for you and for me is that things are going to continue to change, and things are going to get more and more challenging for us as we live in these days, at least in this culture. But it's kind of a worldwide phenomenon going on right now. And so we need not be, I just want to encourage you not to be astonished. I don't know how many times I hear from people, can you believe, did you hear about this? And there's just this shock, of course, and there's some fear attached to it. And the thing I want to encourage you with is that we as kingdom people, and that's what we're learning as we go through the Sermon on the Mount, right? We as kingdom people are not of this world, and so really nothing should shock us. This is not our Father's world. This is the world of the prince of this world, of the demonic. And so there should be nothing that shocks us anymore. It's okay that we're shocked initially, but we have to move past that. And I'm not sure, with all the people we talk to, I'm not sure that those of us who are kingdom people are right now doing a real good job of moving past the shock stage. We just kind of seem to be treading water, if you will, in that shock stage, just continually shocked. I'm shocked every day. Can you believe it? Can you believe what we're seeing now? Did you hear about this? I understand it for a moment, but we're kingdom people. And so, life is hard and then you die sounds so negative. Life is hard and then we really live is what it is. So I want to encourage you not to be shocked, and I want to encourage you not just to look at it as what we shouldn't be doing now. Now I've just said it, don't be shocked, don't be dismayed, don't be afraid for sure. Fear not is one of the most common commands in Scripture. But I want to encourage you now by prompting you, prodding you, encouraging you to do a couple things. Okay? Like Jesus said, it's not just enough to take the demons out of somebody. They'll come right back. You need to fill it with something else. So we're going to pull back and say, okay, enough of the shock and awe of what's happening in our culture. And maybe in your own personal life, there's things like that as well. There's that personal application of it. But I want to encourage you to now take a couple steps towards something very important that I believe is what Jesus is saying. This is how you live. Remember, Jesus knows about this. He lived on this earth under the regime of the Roman Empire that was very similar to a Marxist mindset. You just don't speak against the empire. And so he knew what he was talking about, and he never really talked that much about Rome or the Roman Empire. He talked about how then we should live in his kingdom. So that's what we're going to do for the next couple of weeks at least, and I think it'll be a lot of fun. So this first lesson is going to be, it's going to be very much about what you see behind me, and I'll describe it in more detail in just a few moments. So let me summarize what I just said, and that is we live in perilous times, and I want you to have a discussion time together. What do you think I mean by that in detail? I've already covered some of it, an overall picture. What do you think it means to live in perilous times? So God's Word certainly predicted, allowed for these perilous times. Let me give you a couple passages. 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 1. But mark this, there will be terrible times in the last days. People will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boastful, proud, abusive, disobedient to parents, ungrateful, unholy, without love, unforgiving, slanderous, without self-control, brutal, not lovers of the good, treacherous, rash, conceited, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, having a form of godliness but denying its power. That's what will go on. Does that not describe the headlines of our day, or at least your awareness of what's happening? And then he finishes by saying, have nothing to do with those people. In other words, I know we have all bought into it, and we should be an influence, but it's not that we're supposed to be relationally tight with the people who are living this way in our culture, and some of them, quite honestly, are in the church for sure, having a form of godliness, and we'll talk about that in some detail. Let me give you another passage, 1 Timothy 4:1. The Spirit clearly says that in the later times, some will abandon the faith. We're seeing that a lot, and they'll follow deceiving spirits and things taught by demons. In the Olivet Discourse that Jesus spoke in Matthew chapter 24, which was aimed at the people who would live through 70 AD or into 70 AD there, that's what he was aiming at. But there are many people who think it'll also be applicable for us in the later days. He said this, "At that time many will fall away and will betray one another and hate one another. Many false prophets will arise and will mislead many. Because lawlessness is increased, most people's love will grow cold, but the one who stands firm to the end will be saved." That was his encouragement, as within many of those people's lifetime, they would be conquered. They would come under the pressure and the abuse of the Roman Empire, and Jerusalem would be flattened, basically. Millions would die. And he's saying, this is what's going to happen. People's love will grow cold towards the end of that time. I think it's probably true today as well. And he just, again, says, you have nothing to fear, but he who stands firm. And so that's what we want to do today, is how then do we stand firm in these times? How do we go about doing that? So again, the question we're dealing with is, how then should we live in these times in which we do live? What's the kingdom way to live? G.K. Chesterton once put it this way: the Christian ideal has not been tried and found wanting. It has been found difficult and left untried. Discussion question number 2. What do you think he means by that? So it is possible that people just don't try it, and so they wouldn't know how Christianity is supposed to work. But I think there's another thing at work here, and that is that the Christianity that is being presented to people, the people who are under the assumption they are living the Christian life, may not realize is that the form, the appearance of Christianity that they are given is not accurate. I want to go to a guy by the name of Scot McKnight. He's a professor at North Park College in Chicago, and McKnight is a professor of an actual Jesus class, and he talks about how he begins this Jesus class, and he asks the question to the young people there in his classroom. He says, how would you describe Jesus? All right, so they would go at describing him as, humble or wise or whatever the case may be. And then he asks them a really intriguing second question: describe your personality. And here's what he concluded. I think it's incredible. And there's other studies that back this up, at least for young people, but I think it's also true of our lives as well. We tend to think Jesus is like us. That's the bottom line. When we think of Jesus, he's white, middle class, conservative, of course. Tony Campolo years ago used to talk about going into a black church in Philadelphia and looking up the wall and seeing a black Jesus with an afro. And he also talked about going to a Chinese church, and Jesus in that church was Chinese. And it's a real issue we have with thinking that Jesus is like me, of course. And the reality is, Jesus is really nothing like me. In fact, Scot McKnight says this about his studies. He says, the test results also suggest that even though we like to think we are becoming more like Jesus, the reverse is probably more the case. We try to make Jesus like ourselves. Is that possible? 300 years ago, the French philosopher Voltaire put it this way: if God has made us in his image, we have returned him the favor. All right, what does this look like? I read a book recently by an author by the name of Skye Jethani, and he had some interesting takes on how we relate to God. And he categorized our relationship with God, basically, most of us, into 4 categories, and then there was a 5th that we'll get into. But I want to talk to you about those 4 categories that he uses. I'll tell you the way he describes them, but they were a little murky for me, so I'm going to kind of fudge on that a little bit and try to transpose it into a more understandable kind of summary of it. And it was this: it was life over God, number 1, life from God, number 2, life for God, number 3, and life under God. Now we know that life and God are one and the same. John 1:1 says, in him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. God and life. In Jesus was life. He brought life. And of course in John 14:6, Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, I am the life. You can't get to the Father except through me. So we're trying to understand how we do life. And so we know that life and God is synonymous. There's no real life without God. Jesus said, I came to give you abundant life. And so this author talks about, life from God, life under God, life over God, all those kinds of things. And I kind of get kind of confused about where he was going, but I was able to summarize each point. So let me give you the summary of each of those, because it really does help us understand how our relationship to God actually is working for many of us. Again, there's these four. I'll start with the very first one. I'm going to call it follow the science, because that's a really familiar term to most of us right now. And what we have found out is following the science isn't really following the science, it's more following the money. I'm going to give you one key word to maybe remember as we talk about our relationship to God. And so this first one, where I'm saying follow the science, is really about formula. All right? Science is usually all about a formula. We've come up with a formula. Isaac Newton came up with this formula. What goes up comes down. That's a formula for life that will come in handy for you to know. The second law of thermodynamics is a formula that says everything wears down. But for us and how we relate to God, it goes much deeper. So with this approach or mindset when it comes to God, what we've done is we abandon God in favor of methods and principles that we think are proven. Does that make sense? So maybe God doesn't just absolutely cease to exist, but in our minds, maybe he wound the clock up, and then stepped away. But what's really important are the principles and theories by which we live that are true on this earth, and that's where we place all our trust. Okay, so this approach with God where we say, he's stepped away or he doesn't exist at all anymore, but we have these theories, these principles to live by. They go much deeper than science. Of course, there's science and evolution. Evolution is one of those, that you hear everywhere, that, we've evolved and that we place our trust in. We always evolve. That's how we explain things, but it's really a poor explanation. We won't get into that. But there's bigger things. There's deeper things that apply to most of us in an everyday sense. There is the idea that our hobbies, our careers, our trends, our fads, our organizational abilities, these are all things, these are all principles by which we live, and we place our faith in those things. I trust in the science, I trust in the principles by which I live, and that's where I go. And it may be certain therapies that I'm involved with, and exercise and hobbies and wealth and accumulation. All those things are theories of how to live. Education would be one of those. And that's where we place our trust. And that's how any relationship we have to God, it's very distant if it's anything. And that's where kind of the first category of people, he would call this living over God. I want to go to the second kind of mindset or approach to relating to God. And I'm going to call it the vending machine approach. Okay? And it really is about being consumers. That when we relate to God, it's in the mindset of a consumer. This is a professor at the University of North Carolina that has done studies with young people, again, in college, and about their beliefs. And their approach with God, what have you. And the first thing he found is they almost always reflect what they grew up with. And we know that to be true from Scripture, that we imprint upon our kids, and it stays with them for good or for bad. But that's the first thing he found. The second thing he found is that for the most part, young people tend to see God as a butler, as a therapist, or a vending machine. So I'm choosing the vending machine thing because I know people, have therapists and they can be offended by that. But the idea is I go to God for what he gives me. All right, maybe he gives me good counsel. He's my therapist. Maybe he's my butler and he serves me every day. He does things for me every day, and that's what I'm focused on. Maybe he's a vending machine and I just pick and choose what I want, and it's his obligation to give to me. We are consumers. And never before in the history of the world have there been more consumers than there are now, especially in our culture. To some degree, you and I, all of us, are consumers. A few lessons ago, I mentioned the Blue Bloods series, which is a great series. We love it. But I get a kick out of the fact, it's a Catholic family, I get a kick out of the fact that their prayer, every time they sit down for a Sunday dinner, is the same. Yeah, it's a rote prayer. I don't know how deep it goes in how they feel, but it's, bless us, O Lord, and these thy gifts, which we are about to receive from thy bounty, through Christ our Lord. Amen. Bless us, keep giving us gifts. That's the whole point. We're saying this, we just want to remind you that we're here to consume what you give us, and we know that you've given us this, and that's good, but that's what we do with you, is we consume that. Now, that doesn't have to travel very far before you get to that prosperity gospel, right? And that's rampant in our culture. And that whole idea is the vending machine God, that God would never want us to suffer. He only wants to give us good gifts. In 2010, Dr. Joyce Meyer, the female public preacher, TV preacher, was doing an article. They were interviewing her, and it was in a Time magazine article where she said the following: who would want to get in on something where you're miserable, you're poor, broke, and ugly, and you just have to muddle through until you get to heaven? I believe, she says, God wants to give nice things. And so that really summarizes the idea of consumerism, the prosperity gospel, the health and wealth mentality. Take you back to economist John DeGroff in his book, Take Back Your Time, where he says, our enormously productive economy demands that we make consumption our way of life. See, it has to be that way in this culture in order for the culture to keep going the direction it's going. He goes on to say that we convert the buying and use of goods into rituals, that we seek our spiritual satisfaction and our ego satisfaction in consumption. We must be consumers for life to go on as it is, he says. Unfortunately, that seeps into our approach to God. We are consumers. He's the vending machine. I'll tell you, God, what I want. You're obligated to give it. So as you've just seen, the first approach to God, where we're going to follow the science, the formulas of life, we're good. That's pretty obvious to see. These are people that really could care less about God, want nothing to do with Him. The next three, the one we just covered, and the next two after that, are more subtle, and they're more confusing to us, I think. And so this last one, where it's a health wealth gospel, he's the vending machine, a little bit more subtle, but you can hear it, you can see it in people's lives, where they're just going to take from God. God's obligated to give to us constantly bountiful gifts. And now this third approach that this author talked about is what I'm going to call the you need me approach. The you need me approach. And it's the servant. The key word is servant. Okay? And here's the idea. I serve God, and so that brings satisfaction in my life. See, on the surface, that sounds great. And we are called servants of Christ. Paul called himself a servant, a bondslave of Christ. So biblically, you say, well, that's right in line with that. And while it is, while there's no doubt that Jesus came to be a servant amongst men and we're to be like him, and so serving God is really essential to who we are, there is a fine line between purely serving God and yet saying, my service to God is because He needs me. All right, that's a dangerous place to go. Anytime you put God and need in the same sentence, you're in trouble. God needs nothing. He is totally autonomous. He does not need us, and He does not need us to serve Him. And we've kind of mentioned this before, but it's really important. God doesn't need my service. The second part of this gets a little dangerous, is the idea that, and I use that service for God to bring me satisfaction. And there's nothing wrong with that, right? That can easily slip into a very self-centered approach to living in the name of serving God. And believe me, I've done it. I've known so many people who do it. Serving God is like a badge they wear, and they actually draw attention to how they serve God, and it gives them value and meaning. And so in a subtle way, it becomes about me. It becomes about us. And so that's one way. Another way people approach the relationship with God is, I'm here to serve Him. But the subtle thing, sounds great on the surface, the subtle thing underneath is, and it brings me satisfaction. And my own satisfaction now becomes the real pursuit of my life, and I'll use the cover of serving God to do it. Now there's one more issue with this approach, and that is that serving God has to involve other people, right? Serving other people, which gets really messy, and the word that comes to my mind is disillusionment. We become disillusioned, and I've been there. We become disillusioned because serving God by serving people gets ugly sometimes. People are not always grateful. They're not always thankful. They're not always really encouraging of your efforts to serve. In fact, sometimes they see it as an opportunity to take you out. And so you become disillusioned. And I don't know how many people have left the full-time ministry, for whatever that's worth, because they were disillusioned, and I have been there, totally disillusioned with the idea of serving God. Why? Because I was expecting something in return, and what I got in return was no bueno. It was not good, you know. And so then we're disillusioned, and we say the serving God thing is for the birds. So the fourth approach that this author says that we take with God sometimes, again, he has a different phrase for it, but here's the phrase I like for it, as I paraphrase it for you, is this: let's make a deal. Okay, if there's a key word, it's bargain. We bargain with God. We say, okay, I'll do my part. Okay, I'll serve and I'll worship and I'll give financially, and I'll even abandon my own personal desires on your behalf. But it's all part of a bargain. It's all part of a deal that I have with you. Back in 2010, to give you an example of this, there was a guy by the name of Steve Johnson who was a wide receiver for the Buffalo Bills. And they were playing in a November game against the Pittsburgh Steelers. And the game went into overtime. But I read about it later where Steve Johnson, as a wide receiver, was wide open in the end zone. A ball was thrown to him and he dropped it. And they went on to lose that game. So obviously everybody pointed to him dropping the ball as though he lost the game. And you say, well, that happens, it's unfortunate. But later on Twitter, I want to read to you what he wrote. And this is what he wrote. I praise you 24/7. And this is how you do me? You expect me to learn from this? How? I'll never forget this. Ever. What was he talking about? On Twitter, social media, he was breaking up with God. He really was. He was saying, I do all these things for you, and you allow me to drop a game-winning pass? Now, you and I can go, that is so childish. But tell me, do you ever do that? Do you ever say, God, I've served you. I obey you. I abandon all fleshly pursuits. I worship you. I do these things for you. The least you could do is clean up my life. The least you could do is keep me from suffering, me and my family from suffering. And we have this little bargaining thing we do with him. Let's make a deal, God. And we may not openly talk about it, but we literally approach God that way. And that, again, is really falls short of the reality, is the point. These four perspectives, these four approaches to God, we fall way short of what the reality is. And so again, we're disillusioned, right? I'm totally disillusioned. I've done everything you asked me to do. I couldn't be better. I should get something in return. And if you feel that way, I would direct you to the book of Job. Job would be at the top of the list saying, what have I done wrong? And the very point as to why Satan was allowed to toy with his life is because he had done everything so right. And Satan was sure that he would fold under pressure. And God said, take this servant of mine. But this deal, this bargaining with God is a dangerous way to live this thing out with God. Now you may be saying, Steve, maybe I bargain with God a little bit. Who doesn't? You know, who doesn't think I should get a little bit back for all the time and effort I put into God and His kingdom? It's kind of what we'd call the cause and effect syndrome. Again, Skye Jethani says this: many of the people accomplishing the most for God seem to reflect His character the least. Ouch. I think that is absolutely true. Many people I've known who seem to be doing so much for God, you look at them and their attitudes and their demeanor, you'd say, I don't even know if you know God, but you're doing a lot for Him, evidently. Then he went on to say, there is a correlation between meanness and how absolutely certain a person is about their beliefs. Wow. There's nothing wrong with being solid in what you believe, but if you believe what you believe is the most important thing about you, you're probably going to start to become an unloving person. I've seen that so many times. People who are firm in their beliefs, but they're as unkind and unwelcoming and, you know, just mean to be around. And you just think, how do they not see this? But if my life is about what I believe instead of what I live, then that may be the case. So Jethani says that of these approaches, and we've covered the formula approach, and we've covered the bargain approach, you know, let's make a deal, the vending machine approach with God, which is the consuming part, and you need me, I'll serve you approach that many of us have. There seems to be a downside to all those things. Not that we don't do any of those things at some given point in our lives, but there's a real downside. And the question is, why don't they seem to really bring about the best version of ourselves, right? I can be doing any of those things that are ways to relate to God, and yet the version of me is really not pleasant. So it's then that the author gets into the fifth approach to God, and here's where we're going to land today, and it has everything to do with our background. We're in the beautiful Napa Valley, and it's crush season. It's when boys have crushes on girls and girls have crushes on boys. No, it's crush season. In fact, one of the high schools, I coached football at Napa High School, which used to be the Indians as well as Montrose, and now there's something else, of course. And then there's another high school in town, a Maine public high school, and it's Vintage, and they are the crushers. It's the time of year right now where they crush the grapes and get the juice out, and we are so fortunate to be given access to a private place here in the Napa Valley. Our dear friends Harlan and Linda Smetzer set this up for us. We're here in front of vineyards that are used by the Monticello wineries, or you might see them known as on the label as the Corey brothers, and they have allowed us some time here in this beautiful place. And again, this place reminds us of the fifth approach, which I believe is going to be key, and that is with Jesus, with God. Okay, not serving for him or wanting something from him, but doing life with him, which takes us back to John 15. If you'll turn there, we covered it before in the upper room. I want to cover it one more time just so you can get the flavor, if you will, of the connectedness with Jesus that is essential. How shall we then live in these times? We must connect with Jesus in a deep and intimate way, and it is doing life with him. Okay? Yes, do we do things for him? Of course. Just like, I do things for my wife does things for me, but how we characterize our relationship is we do life together with one another. We are a team. And so here we go into John 15. I'm going to read through it real quick, and I am going to spare you some time. I was going to read through it twice, but I want you right away to look for the word remain. Okay, see if you can count how many times I read the word remain in this passage. So Jesus uses this beautiful metaphor, and although he was in the upper room, they had walked by so many vineyards like this, and so they all related to this metaphor of the connectedness of the branch and the vine. And he then uses this to say, this is how we do life. We do it with one another. We do it together. And some of us, it sounds obvious, but I don't know many people who really believe they are doing life with him. We're going to talk about the implications of that, but we're going to read through this John 15 passage once again to refresh your memory about all this. Again, the key word is remain. So here we go, John chapter 15, verse 1. I am the true vine, and my Father is the gardener. He cuts off every branch in me that bears no fruit, while every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes, so that it will be even more fruitful. Let's jump to verse 4. Remain in me, as I also remain in you. No branch can bear fruit by itself. It must remain in the vine. Neither can you bear fruit unless you remain in me. I am the vine, you're the branches. If you remain in me and I in you, you will bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can't do anything. Do you believe that's true? Most of us don't believe that. If you do not remain in me, you're like a branch that is thrown away and withers. Such branches are picked up, thrown into the fire, and burned. If you remain in me, and my words remain in you, ask whatever you wish, and it will be done for you. This is to my Father's glory that you bear much fruit, showing yourselves to be my disciples. As the Father has loved me, so I have loved you. Now remain in my love. If you keep my commands, you will remain in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commands and remain in his love. Were you counting? The word remain, depending on the translation, is there in 10 verses 9 or 10 times. That is the theme, isn't it? Remain. Remain means stay connected. Your translation may say abide. Live with me is the idea. Do life with me. If we're to go out into these vineyards and start pulling branches off the vine, how long would they live? Not long at all. They may look alive for a day, but they're dead. And that's what he's saying. He's saying, this is the arrangement. I know you're going to think about a lot of ways to have an arrangement with my Father and with me. Here is the one that matters. You might remember just a couple lessons ago, we did the whole 23rd Psalm. He is the shepherd, we are the sheep. That is a relationship based on the fact that they do life together. So that theme is throughout Jesus' teaching, without a doubt. The John 10, now in the John 15. It is about staying connected, doing life with him. Not over him, not under him, not from him, not for him, but with him. So, another discussion question, what do you think it means to do life with Jesus? In the practical sense. Let's get really practical. Okay, not theoretically, not philosophically. What do you think practically it would look like if you did life with Jesus all the time? Scripture certainly gives us some clues. We'll start with 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 16. Don't you know that you yourselves are God's temple and that God's Spirit dwells in your midst? He is present inside of us, he's saying. That's how he does life with us. 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 3. His divine power has given us everything we need for a godly life. Okay? We're powered by him to be able to live the life that we're to live. He goes on. And it's through our knowledge of him who called us by his own glory and goodness. Remember, knowledge is not just intellect. It is intimate experience with God. So we're to experience life with him. Through these, he has given us his very great and precious promises so that through them you may participate in the divine nature, having escaped the corruption of the world caused by evil desires. In these days, how should we live? We should take part in the divine arrangement, not in the corrupt culture. That's what he is saying there. So it's not just don't do this, it's do this. Okay? Yeah, don't do that, but you need to replace it with something. Take part in the divine arrangement he has set up, is what he's saying. 1 John 3:24. The one who keeps God's commands lives in him and he in them, together, with one another. And this is how we know that he lives in us. We know it by the Spirit he gave us. So our relationship with him now is through the Spirit, and it is a with kind of relationship. Finally, Ephesians chapter 4, verse 20. But that isn't what you learned about Christ. Since you have learned about Jesus and have learned the truth that comes from him, throw off the old sinful nature, okay? Quit being consumed with the Marxist culture in which we live, all right? Throw it off. Throw off that nature to be consumed by things of the flesh and your former way of life, which is corrupted by lust and deception. Instead, let the Spirit renew your thoughts and attitudes. Put on your new nature, created to be like God, truly righteous and holy. So you throw off and you put on. And what he says is let the Spirit renew your thoughts and attitudes. Where this will be won or lost is in the way we think and the attitudes we have about life. And again, what I'm seeing scares me a little bit, and that is kingdom people who are absolutely fixated. Their attitude is to be fixated and fearful of what's happening around them, and maybe even in their own personal lives. And we need not be that way if we will connect at a deep level with Jesus through his Spirit, practically, all the time, being always mindful of the fact that Jesus is doing life with us. Do you see how that goes so much deeper than doing life for him? Of course we're living for him. But on a minute-by-minute, day-by-day basis, it's doing life with him. So you may be asking, we're not sure how this practically lives itself out, Steve. What does it look like? In essence, what it means is the way we think and our attitudes about life have been transformed. They've been absolutely changed as we connect all the time with the mind of Christ through the Spirit of Christ. And in essence, it's both an invitation and a gift. Let me show you what I mean by that. Matthew chapter 11, verse 28, a very familiar passage, but I want you to look for the invitation and the gift that's connected from Jesus. He says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I'll give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. You'll no longer need to be anxious about what's going on in this crazy culture. You'll find rest for your souls, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light. A yoke, of course, was that wooden structure that made oxen and animals work together. And we may look at it as work and labor and a burden, and he says, I know that's what you may see when you look at the yoke. He says, it's different with me. Come join me, and as you join me, you'll find it's not work. It's not burdensome. It's freeing. In fact, unbeknownst to anyone really until this moment, living for God is not a burden. It's not a heavy thing we carry. It is a privilege. It is an invitation by Jesus. Come. I have a gift for you. Rest for your souls. Isn't that great news in the days in which we live when people are not finding much rest, They're pretty anxious and tied up in knots. This is what he offers. It's an invitation and a gift, and we have the opportunity to accept that invitation and enjoy that gift every minute of every day. In these days in which we live, primarily we must connect with Jesus all the time. Our thoughts match up with his thoughts, our attitudes, our approaches. See how different that is from God give me, God I'll serve you. Yes, of course he will give to us. Of course we'll serve him. But this is different. He gives us this incredible gift, which is rest for our souls, which we all need in these days in which we live. Connecting as the vines and the branches stay connected and bear fruit, and there's evidence of life. That's what we need to see. When I hear fellow kingdom people, Christians, saying, oh, can you believe this is happening? And did you see that? And I don't see life. I see us living like everyone else, in despair. Accept the invitation. Enjoy the gift Jesus offers. So what does that fruit look like? Well, obviously it looks like love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, faithfulness, all those things, self-control. It looks like that. But let me give you something very simple to identify the reality that someone is doing life with Jesus. And it is this simple word, wisdom. Wisdom. What is wisdom? Wisdom is the ability to look down the road and imagine what it is you think your life should look like down the road, and how today's decisions will make that possible or make it not possible. Okay? To have wisdom is to say, this is the kind of person God wants me to become. That will mean that decisions today are based on that outcome taking place. Foolishness, the opposite of that, is I'm going to make decisions on what feels best to me today. What makes me happy today. That's foolishness. He seemingly divides the whole world into wisdom and foolishness. Those who are wise, those who are foolish, at the back end of the Sermon on the Mount. And there's no doubt he is saying storms are going to come in life. Crazy things like Marxism taking over our culture, it's going to happen. Again, he lived in those kind of days. It's not whether those things happen. It's not our focus on those things. It's not our focus on the storm is coming. Our focus is in, am I wise? Am I foolish? And the book of James says, all you have to do is ask for wisdom. He'll give it to you. James doesn't say ask for cars and ask for houses and ask for more money and ask for more possessions. Ask for hundreds of acres of vineyards. You don't have to ask for that. What you need to ask for is wisdom, the ability to know what's going to happen down the road based on my decisions today. And that dictates what I decide today. My choices today. That is huge. The storms will come. Don't fret over the storms. Make sure you're founded on the rock, which is living a life of wisdom based on the words and ideas and attitudes and perspectives of Jesus. That's what it looks like to deeply connect with Jesus in an everyday way. I want to wrap up our time here in a real kind of fun way. J.R.R. Tolkien, who, as you probably know, is the author of the Lord of the Rings series, he came up with this tool, this verbiage, this word tool. And I don't know if he created it or he got it from somebody, but it's brilliant. Okay, so you've heard the word catastrophe. And that means a sudden turn to evil, a sudden surprising turn to evil. And honestly, I look at our culture and it's a catastrophe. I mean, it has suddenly gotten, it's probably always been evil. It just was kind of hidden, don't you think? It's kind of subtle under the surface. Now it's just raging. Just the absolute catastrophe, the evil that's taking place in our culture. It's seen in so many different ways. We didn't need to go in all the different ways. That's a catastrophe. J.R.R. Tolkien came up with a concept, and the word was eucatastrophe. EU catastrophe. Okay? Eucatastrophe. The EU means just the opposite of catastrophe. It's the sudden turn of happiness that's shocking. Here's how he put it. You are suddenly happy in this turn where a story pierces you with joy, bringing you to tears. He likens it to a joint that, a bone that comes out of the socket and it pops back in by itself, and suddenly you're okay again. He says, that's what I bring to the story, this eucatastrophe. And I believe that's such a beautiful picture of what Jesus is bringing. When we connect with him, we have this sudden turn that brings great joy. Like the story that Jesus told of the man who found the treasure in the field and he buried it again, because it says in his joy he went and sold all that he had. He was happy to do it. He had this sudden turn of events that just thrilled him. That's what it means to connect deeply with Jesus. A whole new perspective, a whole different outlook on life, not focused on what God can give me and how much he needs me and what I have to do for him, and can I do life without him using formulas. Not that, but deeply connecting with him, and life happens. Like you see behind me, just life happens. And so that's what we're invited into to enjoy. It's a eucatastrophe. It's a beautiful turning of the tables, the turning of the tide, if you will. So that's the first step I want to encourage you to take now in the days in which we live. We'll take the next step in the next lesson, and that'll be a great place where we film that. And just so glad we can stay in touch even though we're traveling around. We love you so much. Pray so much that you're connecting deeply with Jesus, not doing religion, not doing the other approaches that everybody else is doing. Enjoy your connectedness to Jesus. God bless.